start and then he takes over. So I would like to welcome all of you to our Friday webinar series. And in this Friday webinar series, today is a very special day, I must mention that. And I'll tell you the reason why I say that. But let me first introduce the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare. As you know, we have been in policy-oriented research area for about 3 years now. We have been doing good quality research during COVID, thanks to our chairman who has been writing extensively on COVID and various aspects during COVID and various aspects of recovery after COVID. The EGROW Foundation has been making efforts to discuss contemporary policy issues, and to do so, we have been introducing these contemporary issues in the webinar series. Today's webinar in continuation of the same. We have been very fortunate to have the best minds across the world come and speak to us, including two Nobel laureates. We have tried to have a blend of Indian policymakers and academicians and foreign policymakers and academicians come and speak to us. Today, Professor Robert Lawrence from Kennedy School is speaking to us. To chair the session, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, Chairman of EGROW Foundation. Dr. Arvind Virmani, himself an avid researcher and scholar, he has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. He has also books to his credit. He has worked in the Planning Commission for long years after his short stint at the World Bank. He was the chief economic advisor of our country and also representing India as executive director at the International Monetary Fund. With this, I'll invite Dr. Arvind Virmani to chair the session and begin the proceedings.
Thank you, Chan. It's a real pleasure for me personally and for EGROW to have Robert Lawrence speak to us. He's an old friend of mine from way, way back. I don't know. Like he said, to mention the number of years makes us sound very, very old. And I'll tell you as I go along why that is so. Robert Lawrence is Professor of International Trade and Chair of the Practice of Trade Policy Executive Program at Harvard Kennedy School. And as you'll see from some of the things he has been involved in, he actually fits the bill very well for us. We talk about research-based policy advice and policy-oriented research, and I don't know of any other researcher in the world, actually, personally, who fits that bill as well as Robert does. He has been a senior fellow at the PIIE, the Peterson Institute. He's been a research associate at NBER, and he served on the Council of Economic Advisors, President's Council from 98 to 2000. And if you look at his books, they all kind of illustrate what I just said about, which is kind of our motto, is among his many books, Crimes and Punishment, Retaliation under WTO, Regionalism, Multilateralism, and Deeper Integration, Single World, Divided Nation, Can America Compete? Has globalization gone far enough? The cost of fragmentation in OECD markets, the prism of globalization, globophobia, etc. A vision for the world economy. So the whole series of books related to practical issues, but all research-based, empirically based work. And we will have a taste of that in his talk also on manufacturing employment. So thank you very much, Robert, for giving us this talk, and over to you.
Very much. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see the.
Yeah, we can see the whole screen.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Okay, now we got the main stuff. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Okay, so it's really a pleasure for me to talk to all of you I'm going to present today a section of a book which is going to be released sometime towards the end of this year. And the book is called Behind the Curve, Can Manufacturing Still Provide Inclusive Growth? And what I'm going to do is to concentrate on the implications of my findings for countries that are emerging. I believe, and I hope I can convince you, that while every country has its own problems, the profile of growth in manufacturing is widely shared. And I think that when countries, as India did, set targets for their share of manufacturing in their economy and consider their economic policies, they ignore these powerful global forces at their peril. So I'm going to start off by looking at asking why manufacturing has been important historically, and briefly describe its state today. I will then describe the normal profile that manufacturing employment follows as countries develop. And I'm going to try to persuade you that it is an inverted U curve. You know, everybody knows that as countries develop, the share of agricultural employment declines. Everybody knows that as countries develop, the share of services employment grows. But what exactly is the typical profile of employment in manufacturing? I believe it's an inverted U shape. In the initial stages of development, we see growth in employment shares, but thereafter countries peak. And that's what I'm going to try to persuade you of. Let me first ask, why is it that manufacturing is viewed as important? Well, historically, in developing countries, manufacturing has allowed for fast growth as workers move off the farms, where they tend to have low productivity rates, to manufacturing, in which their productivity growth levels are higher. And this is why we see when countries get their act together and start to grow, they can grow very rapidly. Manufacturing also allows for more inclusion, because workers who move to work in industry earn higher incomes, and this gives them an opportunity to join the middle class. Manufacturing also allows countries who can export these products to acquire foreign technologies by trading labor-intensive manufactured goods for equipment. And that's also an important source of growth. And manufacturing has also provided scale economies, because often developing countries are limited by the size of their domestic market. But by exporting, these countries can avail themselves of, certainly in the early stages, of a basically infinitely elastic demand for their products. Now, in developed countries, manufacturing also is a major generator of productivity growth. It's the sector with the highest share of research and development. And historically, it too has been a major escalator for workers, particularly those who don't have a college degree, to get a job that can allow them to join the middle class. Also, less appreciated is that manufacturing has been an important source of regional inclusion. Until the 1980s, what you see in the US economy and in other major industrial economies is that regions that are behind can grow more rapidly than the leading edge regions by attracting manufacturing investment. And it's also been an important source of inclusion as supply chains have developed. But now the picture is changing, and there are new challenges. In developing countries, the literature has uncovered a phenomenon which has been labeled as premature deindustrialization. And I'll go into exploring this phenomenon. It basically means that countries that have emerged more recently have been unable to achieve the same share of manufacturing employment as today's industrial economies achieved when they were at similar levels of per capita income. Also, of course, developing countries are facing challenges in the current trading system, which is under stress. And in advanced countries, manufacturing employment shares in basically every single advanced country, the share of manufacturing employment has declined since the 1970s, as has the share of spending on goods. So we get a hint here that it's not only about relatively rapid productivity growth, but it's also how it interacts with demand. In addition, the way we manufacture has changed. The jobs that are available increasingly require more skills. Production is also more capital intensive, but it's not capital intensive in the traditional sense of using more equipment or plant. It's using increasingly large amounts of intangible capital, like software and data and branding. So these are all activities which tend not to be the traditional assembly jobs that are traditionally associated with manufacturing. And in addition, certainly within the industrial economies, there has been, since the 1980s, a period of regional divergence in which we see the growth being highly concentrated in the superstar cities like San Francisco in the US, like San Francisco or Seattle or San Diego or Washington, D.C. or Boston, and large areas of the country have become known as rust belts, where growth is much, much more sluggish. And these tend to be regional areas which depend more on manufacturing. And you'll see the same thing in Europe. You'll see in France concentration around the Ile-de-France, basically Paris area. You'll see it concentrated around London, but you'll get the Midlands and other areas where there is a much more depressed economy. So I also think that this phenomenon has reverberated through the political system, and the source of populism and political shocks that we've experienced, like Trump's election, like Brexit, are often being driven by the political disenchantment felt by workers who would once be employed in manufacturing, but no longer have those opportunities. So let me try to persuade you that manufacturing follows a curved path as economies develop. First, let me show you the share of manufacturing employment in the United States economy as it developed over 200 years. And what you see, I would say, are two very interesting phenomena. The first is the green line, which basically captures mainly services, rises continuously. The blue line, which is the share of agriculture, as I indicated earlier, falls continuously. And then there's manufacturing, which rises until the early 1950s, and after that declines. By the way, you'll notice something which really surprised me. In 1815, the share of services in the US economy was much higher than the share of, or significantly higher than the share of manufacturing. The traditional story of development is countries go through three phases. They move out of agriculture, then they move out of manufacturing, and they move into services. In reality, throughout the process of development, the services sector actually has a higher share of employment and expands more rapidly. We fitted a curve to data on these shares to a sample of 42 countries from the GGDC database, which is collected by a think tank in the Netherlands. And lo and behold, we found that our regressions produced these curves, which fit the shares as the country's per capita GDPs increased. We've also fitted these curves to different regions in the world. And what you can see is just a global sample, which produces the curve. You can see in the developed countries, they're basically concentrated on the right-hand side of the curve. We see the developing countries, they're on the left-hand side. And the curve doesn't fit so well, but nonetheless, it emerges in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and in Europe. So this is pervasive. That's, in a sense, if you remember one thing from this talk, it's the pervasive nature of this phenomenon. So what explains this inverted U curve? And what I do in the book is to develop a model, as simple as I can make it, to capture the forces that are generating structural change. And in effect, there are three very powerful forces. The first is, of course, technological change, which differs across the sectors. The second is the demand responses to income growth. And the third is trade performance. You know, often in many countries who experience deindustrialization and a decline in employment, the debate is usually between those who are blaming the robots and those who are blaming China. In a sense, those who are emphasizing technology and those who are emphasizing trade. Very rarely do you see people actually pointing to demand patterns, which I believe are the third peg of the stool, if you will, and it's necessary to integrate these into the account of structural change. Of course, in other contexts, when we're trying to talk about structural change, people do talk about demand and the Engel curve and so on, but in much of this debate about manufacturing, it seems to be totally ignored. So let's start off by looking very briefly at technological change. You can ask the general question, and I love to do this with my students, does rapid technological change increase or decrease employment? And of course, if you've studied economics, you'll know that, as with most questions, the answer depends. Relatively rapid productivity is likely to cause the products in that sector to become relatively cheaper. And then the crucial question is, will the demand for those products be elastic or inelastic? If the demand is inelastic, we're going to see employment declining. If the demand is elastic, conversely, we could see it rising. Now, to persuade you that actually the prices do reflect relative productivity growth, here I show you for the United States labor productivity, but I could have done it with total factor productivity as well, relative to GDP's productivity. And what you can see is that manufacturing productivity, as recorded, is relatively rapid. Now, please don't be confused. I show you the inverse of the relative price of manufactured goods. So when this line goes up, manufactured goods are getting cheaper. And this is what the line looks like. So what you see is, as we expect in theory, basically, relatively rapid productivity growth in manufacturing leads to declining relative prices in manufacturing. And that's an important part of this story. Now, if we look at the share of goods in US consumption, if we go back to 1959, and you'd find the same pattern across all developed countries, Americans were spending something like 55% of their consumption spending on goods. Today, it's barely a third. It did tick up during the COVID crisis when, of course, services crunched to slow growth. But the typical pattern has been this very strong downward trend, suggesting an important role for demand. Here I show you something that also reinforces the idea of demand. And that is what happens to spending on goods as people get richer. What you can see here is I've got the 5 quintiles in which people are ranked according to their income. And what you see is in all cases, there's a declining curve. And that tells us more or less the effect of this inelastic price effect. But it also captures the fact that poor people spend more of their money on goods than do rich people. Now, poor people buy clothing, they need manufactured food, footwear, and so on. Rich people need psychiatrists, personal trainers, tax consultants, and spend more of their money on services. And so there are income effects, and there are also going to be the response to relative price effects. So even before we start to talk about trade, basically you can generate this curved effect in a simple model, by making some standard assumptions which are all plausible. The first is assume that productivity growth is most rapid in agriculture, then less rapid in manufacturing, and the least rapid in services. And also assume that the income demand is the reverse, that the income elasticity of the demand for services is higher than the income elasticity of demand for manufactured goods, which is higher than the income elasticity of demand for agriculture. So this would characterize both the rates of productivity growth and the income responses. And then assume that at the sectoral level, it is always the case that the elasticity of substitution is less than 1, that the demand is inelastic. Put those together, and what happens? Well, in the early stages of development, the agricultural sector is large, and it's having the most rapid productivity growth. So food prices, in effect, are falling. But people take advantage of cheaper food, not to of manufactured goods and services. So a huge driver of growth in manufacturing output is faster productivity growth in agriculture. Maybe this was why, the Green Revolution was so critical, for instance, in the acceleration in Indian growth around the 1980s. It's the spillovers into other sectors of the economy that are a crucial consequence. And what it means is that manufacturing and agriculture, as well as services, are complementary to one another. If one has cheaper prices, the demand for the other sectors will rise. So during this initial period, the manufacturing sector is benefiting. There's a positive demand coming from both price effects in agriculture, and as people are getting wealthier because of that productivity growth, there's an income spillover effect as well. So that's the positive force. On the other hand, within manufacturing itself, more rapid productivity growth will lead to declining prices of manufacturing and a force which will tend to cause employment to decline. In addition, since the demand elasticity is higher for services than for manufacturing, manufacturing share will decline for this reason as well. So in an economy with a large agricultural sector, the first force is likely to dominate, and this will cause the share of manufacturing employment to rise. Later, once the agricultural sector shrinks, that positive spillover effect will be much smaller, and then the dominant source of structural change will be the negative force that is coming from more rapid productivity growth in manufacturing and the higher income elasticity of demand for services. So you can see the hump is a natural consequence of these assumptions in a closed economy. We can simulate it. Here I just have some parameters that I plug into this closed economy model. I assume in all sectors the elasticity of substitution is 0.7. I have a high initial share of agriculture, and you can see that the model will generate the same kind of curves as did the empirical work. And so I argue this simple model captures the essence of structural change and in this closed economy. And then there's a question of trade. What happens as a consequence? Well, we know that the curve will not be the same for countries depending on their comparative advantage. Those that are commodity exporters tend to have what's become known as the Dutch disease, and will be heavily importing manufactured goods. This will mean that their curve, the net importers, will lie to the left of a country with balanced trade. On the other hand, as countries or small countries start to grow, if they happen to have a comparative advantage in manufacturing, they enjoy export-led growth because the global market is able to offset the effect of the inelastic demand for these goods at home. So this is in essence kind of the genesis of the Asian so-called miracle, why these countries enjoy export-led growth. But what is noteworthy is that as countries occupy larger and larger shares of the world market, as they fill out become important in different product areas, the demand is no longer infinitely elastic. They find that additional improvements in productivity growth no longer definitely give them positive effects, and you can see in an extreme case employment. So the hump, which characterizes the closed economy, is added to by an additional hump that will confront exporters, successful exporters of manufactured goods as they grow. And what happens over time is that the demand for their products will become less elastic, and because they're more productive, their net exports will contain less labor content. And this means even the most dynamic of the exporters will experience declining shares of manufacturing employment, both because of this internal dynamic, which I described for the closed economy, plus the external dynamic, which I have just described. So this is what we would expect to see. If you're an exporter, you will reach a higher peak. It will lie to the right of the peak you would reach if you had balanced trade. And if you're an importer, your curve would be lower. But it will also, all three of them will face a curve. So let me show you some more pictures. Here are the shares of manufacturing employment in those dynamic Asian economies. And you can see Japan followed a hump, and now, has reached a peak of around 25% of manufacturing employment. And by 2012, it's above around 15. Korea is probably among the most dynamic exporters. The hump is clearly evident, with the Koreans peaking above 25%, but that was in around 1990, and they've experiencing declines. In Malaysia, they're less advanced in this phenomenon, but the hump is there. And Singapore, too, is down to 16 or 17%, whereas it in the late 70s had a 30% share. So the Asians have not escaped, if you will, this hump. And it's also true of China. So China peaked, in my estimate, around about 2013, with a manufacturing employment share on the order of 19%. Today, by 2017, they're at 17.5. They experience a 12.5 million drop in manufacturing employment. So point to Asia, yes, but just notice once they've evolved, they too are experiencing this deindustrialization when it comes to employment phenomenon. Output is growing, but also, although with a lag, will also start to decline. I picked a sample of countries, and I published a Peterson Institute paper. I took the countries with the largest trade surpluses in manufacturing, and what I found was even those countries, they're a sample, whether they include France, UK, Italy, yes, China, South Korea, Japan, I've already explained, Zambia, Germany, another famous manufacturer, all declining shares of employment over time. If you looked at deficit countries, you'll see they also, some of them are poorer, but they too follow a general humped shape. I did something else in which I just looked at the period where we've got some good data from the OECD in its and the WTO in their TIVA project, the Trade in Value Added. And remarkably, I divided the sample. I had 60 countries, and I divided them as to whether they were surplus countries or deficit countries. And I got a lot of numbers in this slide, but I just direct you to the one that I circled. On average, over this period from 95 to 2011, these countries experienced a 4 percentage point drop in their manufacturing employment. The surplus countries experienced a 4.4% decline, and the deficit countries a 3.8% decline. And even when I went to the extremes, the countries with the largest surpluses in manufacturing experienced a 3.8% decline in their shares of manufacturing employment. And that's because these countries that run the surpluses tend to have higher productivity levels in manufacturing. So the impact of running a surplus still raises their output as a share of their GDP. But it also means that it takes fewer workers to produce that output. And it also means that their manufactured goods are getting cheaper. And since the demand is inelastic, their domestic spending is falling. So whilst output does respond positively to an improvement in a trade surplus, that's not necessarily true of aggregate employment, because there are offsetting effects that come via the channel of spending and the channel of higher productivity growth. I also didn't look at changes instead of looking at levels of surplus or deficit, and I get very much the same story. Whether or not you have a positive or a negative change, you tend to experience very similar levels, very similar declines in employment. These data go through 2011 because they are the only ones that are available on a consistent basis, but they've recalibrated GDP accounts, and I've done this over from 2005 until 2015, and I get basically the same results. So the key idea here is that trade surpluses are basically endogenous, and countries with trade surpluses have higher output shares in manufacturing, but this is offset by the fact that their manufacturing productivity is higher. And this in turn, as I've said, leads to lower spending shares and a lower labor content of the trade surpluses. Let me turn now to this phenomenon of premature deindustrialization. So on this chart, I've got the BRIC countries, and I've got, for comparison, Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And you can see lying to the right, countries with a high GDP per capita have all reached significantly higher shares of manufacturing than the countries on the left, which are the BRIC countries. And so we see then the way in which these late emerging economies have been unable to achieve the same employment shares as their predecessors. Again, we fit these curves to different samples, whether it's at the global level, the curve's been shifting down for developed countries, for developing countries, for Africa, for Asia, for Latin America, and for Europe.
Hello?
Yes. Mr. Reddy, yes. Should I go on?
Please keep your mics muted. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Okay. And the curves don't just shift downward in the sense that the peak share is lower, they also tend to shift to the left. In other words, they occur at lower levels of per capita income. So here I show you the data. The US peaks in 1953. Yes, it has a high share, but measured in $1990 in real purchasing power parity terms, its per capita income is around $18,000. The UK peaks at 32, it's at 15,000 when it peaks. But when South Africa peaks, when Brazil peaks, and when China peaks, they are at substantially lower levels of income. So what is it that explains this shift? Well, there are three contending explanations. There's an excellent paper by my colleague Danny Roderick. He considers only two of them. He asks, is this due to productivity growth, technological change, or is it due to globalization? Although in his theory, he notes demand could have an effect, he doesn't really explore the implications of demand. What I do in the chapter of the book that deals with this question is to try to explore all three of these potential forces. So, why might demand be important? I think a very important driver of demand that I would hope to persuade you of is not only has demand in investment tends to be much more manufacturing intensive than the demand for consumption. You know, India has a lot of industrial policies now. You're trying to subsidize the industries to add more value added. I believe a much more effective way, if you really wanted to increase manufacturing output, is to increase your investment rate. But the nature of investment has also been changing. And that is less and less investment is tangible. More and more of the fixed assets, even of manufactured firms, is intangible. And it's about software, it's about databases, it's about intellectual property. If you drive your Tesla, you're basically sitting in a computer with wheels. And that's a very different kind of car than the traditional automobile driven by a combustion engine. So capital equipment, although people talk a lot about robots, and you have a picture of something mechanistic, actually the robot is highly intensive in software. So the nature of investment is also changing, and this can have an effect on ultimately the demand for those employed in the manufacturing sector, especially less skilled workers. So using the model, I simulate what would a manufacturing productivity shock look like? What would happen if productivity were to accelerate? And intuitively, the explanation is simple. Firstly, the faster productivity growth will make, let's say you've got a country that has a per capita income of $5,000. People want to drive a motorbike. Well, in the 1950s, it took, let's say, 200 hours to build the motorbike. When India reaches $5,000 today and builds a motorbike, they're going to have much more sophisticated machinery, which is going to be embodied. The technological change is going to be embodied in the machinery they use. They'll also have learned new techniques. And so they're going to be able to make that car with much less labor. The second effect is the car itself is going to be cheaper because of higher productivity growth. And it's likely that Indians will react to those cheaper cars by spending more money on services. And so it's the increased spending on services at each level of per capita income that is generated by the faster productivity growth that causes the curve also to shift to the left. If the share of employment in services increases at each level of income, the share of manufacturing will fall. And so productivity could well be one of the explanatory variables for premature deindustrialization. If we actually look at what's been happening to labor productivity in manufacturing relative to labor productivity in services, again, I'm throwing a complicated set of regressions at you, but what you can see is if you look at the global level, you can see statistically significant positive effects growing over time. So that controlling for GDP per capita, we are becoming more and more productive at making manufactured goods. It's evident in the global sample. It's evident but not statistically significant in Asia. It's not so evident in Africa. It's highly evident in Latin America. So there are these regional effects, but overwhelmingly, it's relatively more rapid productivity growth that plausibly accounts for one component of premature deindustrialization. The second impact would be trade deficits and trade surpluses. And this is the one the way in which Roderick distinguishes between shocks due to trade and shocks due to productivity is that he points out that if you have a positive shock due to trade, let's say you run a bigger surplus, that will affect both output and employment in the same direction. On the other hand, if you have a positive shock due to productivity, employment will decline, but output should rise. And so he distinguishes these two effects and concludes that in the case of Latin America, especially, and Africa, the dominant impact causing the decline in employment is trade, because it's also associated with a decline in output. And he argues that the liberalization, whereas these countries followed import substitution policies in the early period, in the 60s and 70s, they've been following more open export-led growth since then. And the openness of their economy has exposed them to the world, and this is responsible for their premature deindustrialization. But actually, if you look, and here I show you a table which captures what has actually happened to the manufacturing trade balance as a share of GDP by over the decades, you'll see, the Asian surpluses have been growing. But so too have the African surpluses and the Latin American surpluses. In other words, these countries actually had bigger trade deficits during the period of import substitution than they did during the period of globalization. So the underlying data, I don't think, support this trade interpretation. I bring in demand, because you see, if you only compare trade with, if you only compare trade and productivity, well, you say if output and employment move in the same direction, it must be trade that's causing the change. But if you think about it, the same would be true of demand. If what's happened over time is the demand for manufactured goods has been declining because of what I have suggested, that manufacturing investment has been declining, then you would also see a positive effect due to demand. So the way of discriminating only works if you only consider trade and productivity growth. But once you introduce demand, you could be confusing impacts that are due to demand with impacts that are due to international trade. What I find using value added is that value added is much more intensive in investment than it is in consumption, roughly about twice as intensive. I simulate, I won't take you through this, But I find, therefore, that a declining income demand elasticity would also cause this shift downward. And if people are spending less on manufactured goods and they're spending more on services now, it would cause the curve to shift to the left. So we have these three contending explanations. I do find statistically significant evidence of declines in investment in many areas of the world over time. And I then turn, and I won't go through all this, but basically find that you can explain away a lot of the downward shifts once you introduce these three variables. Trade, to some degree, works in some cases, but more powerful are productivity growth and the demand, the declining demand income elasticity. So my findings differ from Roderick primarily because of this difference in emphasis. How much more time do you want me to talk for?
You can keep going, but how are you capturing demand? It's not clear. That's a bit important. You say you got an investment variable?
I have investment as a share of GDP.
Okay.
And I have a time trend designed imperfectly to capture this phenomenon of growing intangible assets as a share.
And roughly how much difference does that make to Roderick's results, roughly?
It becomes a much more powerful effect than trade.
Okay.
Roderick never explicitly tests these things. He's judging.
Broad judgment, yeah.
He's making a judgment based on output.
Right.
What I'm doing is not only making a judgment on output, but also explicitly putting proxies for trade, for productivity, and for demand into a regression analysis. Now, to admit it, the truth, it is horribly difficult to find instruments when it comes to trade. And so my results have to be taken with a grain of salt. I searched as hard as I could to find instrumental variables that I could use, but I never found one that was very successful in explaining the trade deficit. So I've reached these results. I think they should be taken as somewhat preliminary.
Okay.
So, but I want to raise the importance of demand.
So continue. Really. You have time. You can continue. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So let's look briefly at India. I have not studied the Indian economy in great depth. But there is a legitimate debate about whether this universal phenomenon that I have been emphasizing has really applied to India. If you look at the data of the share of manufacturing employment over the long run in India, what you see is it wobbles all over the place until, in a sense, the early 1990s. You get some peaks, but also let me draw your attention to the fact that this range that I'm illustrating in this picture is between 10% at the when the share is at its lowest, going back to 1960, and 11.5 when it's at its highest. So India's employment share is within a rather narrow range. If you only look since 1990, at least you get the curve. Although it suggests that since around 2010, the employment share has actually been declining. I know that Indian industrial policy had some rather ambitious objectives. They were expressed in terms of value addition, and they wanted to take India, I guess, from maybe 12 or 13% to 25 by 2025. To me, those numbers illustrate the dangers, of economic forecasting. If you want to give a forecast, you can give your forecast, but don't associate it with a date, because it's bound to get you into trouble. Nonetheless, it seems that certainly when it comes to employment, India has actually been moving in the opposite direction. I've also show you here Indian manufacturing value added, using the latest data from which are available from the OECD from 2005 to 2015. And what you can see is, first, this is the Indian trade deficit in manufacturing value added as a share of GDP. Yes, on average, 1.4% of GDP is the deficit in trade in value added. But the change from 2005 to 2015 is virtually minimal. So India has actually, despite the rise of China, been running roughly the same deficit in manufacturing value added. These numbers are a little different because the GNP accounts have been changed. I mentioned that Indian policy has been designed to raise the share of output in GDP, that's value added in manufacturing. But what you see here is actually it's been pretty constant, around 18%. So it hasn't changed a lot over this, it didn't change a lot over this decade. If you look at Indian spending patterns, there you'll see, again, remarkable stability, although 2013 and 2014 are weak years, but again, roughly around 20% of GDP. So that accounts for this trade deficit. And then the employment numbers are all in the range of 11%, or between 11 and 12. And so what that tells you is that Indian productivity in manufacturing is higher than in the economy as a whole. And that's why the share of employment is lower than the share of output. And in effect, productivity is about 50% higher in manufacturing than it is in the economy as a whole. Can ask the question, how does India compare? Again, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. But to me, one of the interesting features is that if you look at Indian spending as a share of GDP on manufacturing value added, you get 19.7. It's slightly on the high side of this average sample of countries. What's particularly conspicuous is that Indian spending on investment is actually rather high. Out of the 60 countries, India is spending 9.3% of value added on investment. In the other countries, in the top 10 manufacturing employment countries, it's 11.9. If you really want to understand China, let me see if I can find it here. You'll see that the real driver of the high share of manufacturing in China has also been its investment. Consumption in India at 9.5 is actually somewhat lower than consumption in other parts of the world. So I would characterize India as having, in international comparisons, a somewhat high share of investment, which is associated with a faster growth rate, and but a lower share of consumption of value added, but not to a large degree. So what's going to happen now? I have already explained, and in my book I go into some depth at the way in which the movement in the United States, from something on the order of 25% of employment in manufacturing to today somewhere around 8%, severely depressed the opportunities available for especially workers without a college degree. And the result is, if you look especially at the employment of men, for whom the manufacturing sector was a very important generator of opportunities, you see that the real wages or real earnings of men without a college degree in the US have essentially remained constant for 5 decades. So although the United States economy has enjoyed growth, this growth has not been inclusive. And a major group who've been excluded from the benefits of the growth have been these non-college educated men. And one part of the explanation is trade, but I think it's a relatively small part. A second is the bias in technological change towards increasingly using more and more skilled workers. And what I notice now is that throughout the world, countries' industrial policies are heavily emphasizing 3 objectives. The first is everybody wants to become sophisticated in digital technologies, in artificial intelligence, in robotics, etc. A second is they're looking for more resilient supply chains because of the concerns in the recent period, and they're emphasizing green technologies as well. The US has just passed this whole initiative, for instance, where it's trying to get to, by 2035, to cease the production of vehicles that are not electric vehicles. And we can ask the question, these technologies, these emphases may well be required from a productivity standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, perhaps even from a reducing risk standpoint. But in my view, they're also likely to strengthen the skill bias in manufacturing technology. And the same is true, for instance, if you looked at the profile of Chinese industrial policies. The Chinese plan is to move into high-tech areas. And this is going to increase the demand for the university-educated, skilled workers. The transition to electric vehicles is also going to be extremely disruptive. While it's being sold as if it's going to create more employment opportunities, this disruption is not getting the kind of attention it ought to get. Just think about the difference between an electric vehicle and one being driven by a standard combustion engine. Well, the electric vehicle has no combustion engine. It has no transmission. Therefore, it has no gears, and therefore a significant part of the auto industry is going to have to disappear. And instead, it's going to have to be replaced with those who produce batteries. It's also the case that whereas the normal vehicle puts a high premium on the demand for mechanical engineers. The electric vehicle puts a demand for software engineers. So we are seeing, both at the level of blue-collar workers and at the level of more trained workers, dramatic potential changes in demand. And I think these could actually exacerbate rather than reduce both wage and regional disparities. So I think these are desirable technologies, but they need to be accompanied by much more active labor market policies, or else the populism, which was driven, I think, in part by the decline in manufacturing employment, is likely to persist. There is, on the other hand, a way in which digital technologies do offer new opportunities. Traditionally, if you have a depressed area, you have two options. You can try to attract new firms to your depressed region, or you can let the people migrate out of the depressed region to the cities. But today, increasingly, as this seminar indicates, there's a third possibility, and that is of remote work. Not just providing services, but actually employment. And this is going to make the outlying areas far more attractive as locations to live in. And this phenomenon won't just stop at the border. So I think the opportunities in services-led growth ought to grow as the application of remote work becomes more widespread. I'll wrap up and summarize what I've tried to argue here. The manufacturing share has a hump as countries develop. I've tried to emphasize that agriculture plays a crucial role, although trade can contribute. But the hump is shifting downwards and leftwards over time, partly due to trade in some countries, but mainly because of technological diffusion and demand. Deindustrialization is important in the plight of non-college men. It's led to non-inclusive growth, and I think this lack of opportunities is a significant factor in the declining skill premium that we've seen. Technology and demand, to me, appear much more important. Trade plays a role in some countries, but overall, in explaining this pervasive curve shift, I don't think it's a very important factor. And finally, the jobs of the future are increasingly going to be in services in both developed and developing countries, and the jobs in manufacturing are going to become increasingly skilled. So I will end there. Be happy to take any questions.
Okay, so Robert, I'm going to make a couple of points, and if you want to respond to any of them, you can, and then we'll move on to taking questions from the audience.
Great.
I guess, Charan, you can keep an eye out for questions because we'll run out of time at some point. Okay, so basically I want to make kind of 4 points. I'm basically trying to apply your results to India, and I'm going to just mention certain aspects which I think are important, which are worth thinking about. Obviously, you've not done research on India, but perhaps you can just give us your top of your head kind of response. Obviously, somebody should do more deeper research on it. So first is agriculture. Now, as you know, India's agriculture still contains about 50% of the workforce, of the total workforce, which is employed. And about 2/3 of the workers are still in rural areas. So rural areas, agriculture. So in that sense, it meets one of your conditions, which you outlined. And the second aspect of it is the labor productivity has kind of been when I last looked at it, it had labor productivity as a proportion of overall productivity has been stuck at something like 50%, 0.5 of the total. And in many other countries which made the structural transformation, you know very well, it improved rapidly. So if we take these two factors and I apply a model to it, it would suggest to me there is large scope for increasing manufacturing employment share in India. So that's the first point. The second point is that we know that we had all kinds of policies earlier, like SSI reservation. You must have come across them sometime, but I'll just summarize because obviously you are focusing on the US. Labor laws, SSI reservation went out slowly and was more or less gone, I think, by around 90s. I don't remember exactly now. And labor laws, we are right here. We've done the big change, but it's still not been notified. It's not, the rules have not been made, etc. So policies, if we drill down into your analysis, you of course haven't got into the details of policy, but it would seem to me that if I apply your model, there's nothing to suggest that if we reform some of the policies which have constrained employment and have pushed or incentivized firms to go for capital intensive, that will also be raise the productivity level, and we could still have an upward portion, which may not be very long or very high, but still there's potential. So that's the second one. The third one is you mentioned, I mean, we can go in, is the concept, the resilient supply chain. That's really, in my view, going to be a big issue for the next 5 years. And let me give you some numbers, which I've actually been looking at recently. And there's substance to it. And what is the substance? Well, I have before me right here data on office and telecom equipment exports, and within that electronic data processing and telecommunication equipment. And if you look at it, the share of China is amazing. I would call it a monopoly. So the share of telecommunication equipment in total world exports is 39% for China. For electronic data processing and office equipment is 40%. Okay, that's a monopoly to me. It looks like. I mean, if we drill down, obviously there'll be some which will be 70%, etc. Some may be smaller, but there's a huge amount of monopolization of exports in there somewhere. Another example, if you take textiles and clothing, textiles is 47% China and clothing 33%. So if we look at some of these things, I would say there is a real genuine risk, not just geopolitical, I mean, geopolitical in an extreme sense, but even otherwise, the two parts. One is the COVID type of thing, which has nothing to do with the rest of the world. It's something which happened and China does something. So both the economic risk per se, without bringing in geopolitics, and then the geopolitical risk if you bring in risk of war, Taiwan, etc., China attacking India or whatever, right? So I would say that if we look at any kind of theory, it tells you should diversify. So again, it would seem to me that there's an opportunity for Indian manufacturing. That's the point. So the 3 point, and finally, your last points on services, which I'm kind of supporting. These three, I'd like a response if you have any. But this whole work from home, work from anywhere, I agree with you. In fact, in our paper, India Vision 2050, which I don't know if you, I had mentioned it to you when we met a couple of months ago, but if you haven't, maybe Dr. Charan Singh can send you a copy of that paper. But I see that, and we can go into the reasons, but as a huge instrument of inclusiveness. For example, women. Again, as you know so many Indians that there is a constraint on women working outside the house, particularly in rural areas. There is a constraint on certain scheduled castes or somebody going again in a village and doing something which somebody considers is not your occupation. So all these people would have a huge opportunity opening up to them when you this new trend or an acceleration of a trend of work from anywhere, work from home gets into the picture. So I see a big increase in inclusiveness and consequently both demand and supply, not just of services, but its impact on manufacturing. But anyway, let me leave it. If you want to respond to any of it, please do. Then we'll go to the questions.
No, I can respond pretty quickly to the main points that you made. The first is agriculture. Yes, I agree. But I would simply emphasize that the lesson that I would like you to take away from this work is that productivity in agriculture can be a major industrial policy. And that seems to be not appreciated as much as it ought to be. The second is, yes, self-inflicted wounds are probably, captured in my residuals, but definitely every country has its own deficiencies, and there is immense scope. India, I've worked on Indian growth even in the 1980s. You had a crazy policy which penalized success, limited the size of certain firms, and rewarded failure by supporting sick firms. Now, I know you've changed those, but nonetheless, there's definitely scope for that. So you mentioned China, and I think now the trends in the world give India an ideal opportunity, because the strategy that many firms are adopting is China plus one. They want to diversify. And so I think this diversification is a crucial opportunity for India. And I see that these new free trade agreements, which India is signing, are an important step in that direction. You signed with Australia, you signed with the UAE. I await with bated breath the specifics of the agreement with the United Kingdom. I think what's crucial, India has always been reluctant to introduce environmental and labor standards into the trade agreements. By contrast, these are de rigueur in the bilaterals and the plurilaterals, which developed countries are signing. I think if India moves on those fronts, after all, it has an interest in environment, it has an interest in labor, it's signed a lot of the core labor standards anyway. I think if it were to move in that direction, it would not only change the global trading system in a seriously important way, but could also offer increasing opportunities for India. So I think all 3 points that you make are very valid. By the way, what I found in China, I showed you the declining employment in China. A lot of that decline is coming as a result of now the supply chains of labor-intensive clothing moving out of China. And this impacts women, particularly in an adverse way. So just as in the US, the deindustrialization affected men without college degrees, it's unskilled women in China who are being adversely affected. And the obverse of that is what you are describing. These are opportunities in these industries, which tend to be female employment intensive.
Good point. Yeah, that's very useful. Right. Okay. So, Charan, you want to make some comments, questions, and then we'll, yeah.
Yeah, Robert, this was very impressive, and we really look forward to your whole book and reading it extensively. I've not read, I'm not I'm not an industry expert, so my questions could be naive. But I had two questions. One, Professor, the whole story of manufacturing changed in the last 20 to 30 years. The way China came into the manufacturing sector and changed the contours of manufacturing. I myself was there at the IMF in 2009 and onwards, and with you, of course, in 2003. My understanding is that the manufacturing market, even in the US, is flooded with Chinese goods. Now, in your sample, I do not know, how do you factor the dominance of China in manufacturing worldwide? Alternatively, my thought was that in the sample countries that you took, in the last 25 to 30 years, China would have robbed many of those countries with manufacturing jobs. I do not know how would you have factored that in. In our own country, I remember 25, 30 years ago, our electronic industry was ransacked by Chinese manufactured products. And our industry, to a great extent, felt strangulated, starved, and had to succumb to China. So, how does that get factored in? The second question, Professor, is the samples. Now, I really haven't gone in details, but in your sample, have you taken the emerging, I'm just trying to understand your conclusion for India, and have you taken other emerging countries? What has been their behavior in terms of the inverted U curve? The third question, sir, is to you because of your experience and if Robert wants to share with us. The manufacturing in the informal sector that happens in India, especially the MSMEs. I'm not sure because the informal sector is so large in the data set which Robert is using. How does the manufacturing in the informal sector get captured? Because in apparel making, you know the informal sector plays quite a prominent role. Thank you.
Oh, um, just remind me, give me your first question. Just the
Yeah, yeah.
oh,
The dominating the way China entered the
I've got
manufacturing
it. Okay.
industry.
So we have, in fact, superb studies which have looked at the impact of China on American manufacturing employment and the emergence of the Chinese trade surplus. And there's a famous paper by Autor, Dorn, and Hansen, and Asimoglu has also contributed to that literature. They conclude that basically in the decade from 2000 to 2010, they can account for something like 17 million, I'm sorry, 17% or 1 million jobs that were lost due to China. But the United States experienced the decline of 5.8 million manufacturing jobs over the same period. And we haven't even started to talk about the positive effects that were due to American export growth. So that 17% is an upper bound estimate. So I'm not disputing that China has had an important impact, but I think its impact has been more important for particular regions and locations in the United States than it has for this aggregate phenomenon where the US lost, 5.8 million jobs. So that's how I would summarize what I take away from the serious studies. In my estimates, I conclude that relatively one thing that's never mentioned almost in the loss of those manufacturing jobs is that the US economy had two big recessions in the course of after 2000. We had the dot-com bubble burst and we had the financial crisis. And so I find that it's demand, the sluggish growth in the demand in the US economy, and manufactured goods tend to be highly cyclically sensitive. So my explanation runs much more in those terms. And I believe that trade could have contributed, but nowhere near as big a factor as these other forces. So I wouldn't deny that China has emerged as a major player in these global supply chains in the way you described it. But nonetheless, even if you look within China, you'll see that a huge amount of the growth in their manufacturing employment is not due to their trade performance. It's due to their very high, extraordinary high rates of domestic investment. So it's on the domestic demand side, which is a much more powerful effect than the trade side. Also, if you look at other developing countries, my sample does include lots of poor countries in Africa and in elsewhere, and you do see the U. In many of these countries, they're still on the upward slope, but it is very slow. But nonetheless, it's a phenomenon that does seem to be quite universal. I'm afraid I have a hard stop at 10 o'clock, which is my time. So I could maybe have room for a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. That's how many minutes left?
You got 5 minutes.
Okay. So, Charan, if you, unless you see some.
Mr. Professor Vijay Kumar had a lot of questions. Well,
Okay.
I can summarize that question just because of paucity of time. He was mentioning that most of the jobs in India moved into the IT sector. So while China was overtaking our jobs in the manufacturing, the jobs were moving into the IT sector. But I don't think you have taken into account IT sector jobs.
They're part of services, if you will, in the
So
aggregate numbers. But I have not done a detailed structural analysis of the Indian economy. And you are all experts. I'm not an expert. I would love to become one by working more on India. I do think that the sluggish behavior of manufacturing is well worth trying to fit into the framework which I have developed. And one part of that could be that IT is important as a cause, but I suspect that it's going to take a lot more analysis on my part and the part of others.
Let me actually reframe the question so that can be your last answer. This debate about India in a macro sense going for services versus manufacturing, which many Indians, including NRIs, have talked about. So that is implicit in your papers, but perhaps you could put it for the general person, what's the implication for your listeners here? That what is the implication of your research for that debate?
Well, I would say that what is increasingly true is that the distinction between manufacturing and services is somewhat arbitrary. And this comes back to the role that information technology is playing in manufacturing. I described the Tesla as a computer on wheels. And if you want to know where is the high value added in manufacturing, it's typically in the initial stages of design, in the, it's called the smile. The value is not in the assembly, it's rather in the design, in the databases, in the artificial intelligence, and then later in the branding and the marketing. And so I think these are all natural Indian strengths. And in effect, we shouldn't be too narrow in our conceptualization of what it's going to take to drive Indian manufacturing. But it might not look like the assembly line and the traditional approach which we're used to. Nonetheless, I think that IT sector offers the opportunity to leverage and to attract foreign firms who can obtain these services in India and, as a consequence, be induced to also start to produce more manufactured goods physically as well.
Thank you. Let me actually give one example and conclude this discussion. when people have, there's been this big talk about semiconductors all over the world and India, and the discussions about PLI scheme, etc. And in that process, it's come out that we already have a number of foreign companies here who are using our software engineers to develop designs for semiconductors. So exactly your point. So, and very important point that we have this very separable view of manufacturing and services, but actually if we just support strengths, I support by not having bad policies or bad infrastructure to constrain them, then as you said, people come in naturally to exploit that advantage, and then if they find competitive opportunities, they'll do the physical stuff anyway once they are here. Okay, so with that, thank you. I mean, it's been certainly very fascinating for me, even though I'm hearing you for the second time, because there's so much to absorb. And I hope other people who came got something out of it. But perhaps, as Charan suggested, if you come back when your book is released, maybe you can hammer it some of these things again a third time or a second time.
Let me just say, I have no objection, to you circulating these slides that I gave. And maybe people who couldn't quite pick up what I was saying, or I was talking too fast, will have can puzzle over them and get more out of them. Although I would appreciate it if they be close held, in the sense that they not put on the internet or somewhere where there is widespread access.
Okay, right. So,
okay, but thank you very much. It's been fun, as always, to see old friends. And to talk to all of you. And I look forward one day to coming back with some much more relevant results for India. So thank you very much.
Robert, this was interesting, and there's lessons for us. So it is, and I thank you for taking those slides dedicated to India. We thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
So I must say that we have had a very interesting session today. For some of us, this must be very new, and we are eagerly waiting for Robert's book, and we'll invite him as the book is out. So we thank him. The webinar next week is on reforms, and we have Mr. Vijay Kelkar, who was earlier the Chief Economic Advisor and ED at the IMF and the Chairman of the Finance Commission, in discussion, in dialogue with Dr. Arvind Virmani. We will tell you the time. It's most probably going to be 4:30 to 5:30, depending on the convenience of Mr. Kelkar, and the flyer will give the details. I would like all of you to please join, and we discuss the reforms in the past and lessons for the future. With that, let me once again thank our chairman, Dr. Virmani, to have chaired the session, spent time. I also thank Professor Robert for having spared the time early in the morning, yet to start his day, to come and chat with us, and all of you to make this discussion so interesting. Thank you very much.